Introducing the right-wing war on education, starring Betsy DeVos, evangelical Christians, and a few dudes who rented out strip malls, called themselves schools, and stole your public school tax dollars.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Amen.
In this hour, we'll talk about how Republicans want to dumb our kids down and what we have to do to stop them. As always, leading the conversation is Patti Vasquez. But with her, we have Kirk Bangstead of the Minocqua Brewing Company, who is leading the charge to get rid of the parasitic voucher school system in Wisconsin. And a few fellow public education warriors he brought along to educate us. The right-wing war on education is brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company. Take it away, Patti.
As you know, this brewing war on education is being fought back by our very own Kirk Bangstead, who's leading the charge in Wisconsin and bringing along so many champions of public education along with him. And so we're thrilled. It's a lot going on. What was the reaction that you've gotten last week, Kirk, since our first episode of the right-wing war on education?
So not only I've been called a racist by this group called the Wisconsin Right Now, said I was trying to take away all the good education that the people of color were getting in Milwaukee. Just today, there was another op-ed in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel by one of the wealthiest Republican senators in Wisconsin, saying that he's somehow gotten bipartisan Democratic support for voucher schools, which is hilariously wrong. So they're actually starting to kind of wind up the message machine in Wisconsin for school choice, and we'll talk about that with our guests. But we know they're starting to worry because they kind of ruled the roost for all of this century so far in terms of getting what they wanted in voucher schools, and I think they're starting to worry that this is not going to be the case anymore.
Well, and part of that, the reason it's not going to be the case is the war that you're waging right back. So tell us a little bit about what you hope to accomplish in the lawsuit that you are going to be charging forward with.
Yeah. So it's been, all of these shows, and this is our second show, and we're going to keep on going probably at least until the end of 2023. All of the last 6 months, I've been raising money, and I've been gathering a team of lawyers to come up with the best way that we can end the voucher school program in Wisconsin, which is siphoning. It's a parasitic way to siphon money out of the public schools and to give it to private schools, and it doesn't even help kids. And so we've been doing this for a long time, and so this part of this radio show is. Unfortunately, the word school choice has become kind of synonymous with something that people want. Weirdly, because pro-choice is obviously a word that a lot of people don't want, especially on the right-wing side of things. But so I didn't want to just bring a lawsuit without actually trying to explain to people, listeners in Chicago, Minneapolis, and obviously everyone that I can possibly reach in Wisconsin. We just don't want to get rid of voucher schools without telling people why they're bad. And that's what we're doing here today. And I brought an amazing guest with me today, Patti.
I'm so thrilled. I'm excited about it. I want to know, well, first of all, before we introduce our wonderful guest, there is a title for this segment because we're broadcasting this on WCPT 820 AM on 950 AM, which is in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And of course, we're live streaming to hundreds of thousands right now, which is exciting. And we have every single week, we have a different focus for what we're going to talk about. So tell us a little bit about the title for today's conversation.
So today's conversation, and by the way, my partner in crime who couldn't be here tonight is Professor Emerita Julie Underwood, who really is getting all of our guests, and she's been fighting this battle for so long, and she's such an expert about voucher schools in Wisconsin. But the title, this is her title: From Zero to 444 Million. How did we get here? It's a story of voucher school privatization in Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. So to have this conversation, you have brought in an expert, and tell us about our guest and why she's here.
So we got Julie's galore here. Professor Julie Underwood, and she's a retired professor, and we got Professor Emerita Julie Mead. And Julie was a professor. She just recently retired a few years ago. She was a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis. And her research was focused on, and she wrote a lot about topics related to the legal aspects of education. And her research centered on legal issues related to special education and legal issues raised by various forms of school choice. So Dr. Mead is the perfect person in Wisconsin to give us the history. We got to lay it out for people. Like this just didn't come out of nowhere. This has been a process for the last, I think, 30 years or so. So before, I don't want to talk anymore. Dr. Mead, can you explain what are the roots of school vouchers in Wisconsin?
Well, I'm going to take you back even further. Sorry, but I'm going to take you all the way back to the mid-50s, actually. And so, yeah. So the person who's usually considered to be kind of the intellectual heft behind the idea is an economist named Milton Friedman out of the University of Chicago. And in the 1950s, he was positing economic theories as ways to shrink government, keep government lean. And one of them was to do away with public education and give every child a voucher to go wherever they wanted. He believed that that was the best way to go. And actually, the first folks who picked up on that idea were policymakers in the South, who used school choice as a way to evade desegregation after Brown versus the Board of Education was issued by the United States Supreme Court. That continued for a little bit until we got US Supreme Court cases saying that use of school choice was unconstitutional and they couldn't do that. And we also had a US Supreme Court case that said that you couldn't send direct funds to religious schools, which was thought to foreclose vouchers for a very long time. And then in the late 80s and 90s, these ideas of vouchers were coming back, but doing the funding in a slightly different way that they thought might be able to pass constitutional review or constitutional muster. And so here in Wisconsin, it was Governor Tommy Thompson who brought the idea to the state. It was passed as part of an omnibus bill, a big bill that had a lot of other stuff in it too. And so it was passed in 1990. And at that time that it was passed, it was very, very small, very small. So it was only in Milwaukee. It was limited to about 1,000 students. The voucher was about $2,500. To be eligible, a child's family could make no more than 175% of the federal poverty level. And the schools that participated in the program had to be non-sectarian, located within the geographic limits of the city of Milwaukee, and they couldn't enroll more than 49% of their student body population by means of that publicly funded voucher. So that's how the program started, with the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. And then it was fairly immediately, as you can guess, probably challenged. And so that initial version was challenged in a case called Davis versus Grover, where in a 4-3 decision by the Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld it. And then in the 1995, they expanded the program, 95, 96, they expanded the program to include religious schools. And then that too was challenged. And then in the Wisconsin Supreme Court in a close decision again upheld it. That one was predominantly a challenge against the program as violating the separation of church and state.
Sure.
But the Wisconsin Supreme Court said that was not a concern. That case was appealed to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court didn't hear it. But it did hear another similar case out of the state of Ohio, in 2002. And the United States Supreme Court upheld vouchers. And then, we were off and running, of course, after our 1998 decision, we were off and running. Then the state expanded its voucher footprint, if you will, by adding the Racine Parental Choice Program in 2011, the statewide parental choice program, or the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, in 2013, and then the Special Needs Scholarship Program in 2015. So now Wisconsin has 4 separate voucher programs that operate in the state.
Wow. Well, and so does the funding, because it's been upheld by the Supreme Court of Wisconsin and then by the federal Supreme Court, how much of the funding comes from federal education funds? Is it all state funds? So it's all, and so that has to come from basically the pot of money that is intended for public education. And how do they justify that? Was the argument that, well, the schools aren't offering an education that reflects what this community wants? What was it? Do you know what their argument was in order to have the, okay. Oh,
yeah, I do actually, because it's laid all out for you. If you go to read Davis versus Grover, they'll that original court case, they'll lay it out. And so the argument at that time, the argument was that we had persistent concerns about student achievement outcomes, particularly in Milwaukee. And they were persistent. And so that the state wanted to do something to try it. And school choice had not been tried. And so they wanted to run this experiment in their largest school district to see whether or not school choice could meaningfully influence student outcomes. And so that was the justification given for the original bill.
Oh, just to see. Not
just to see. It's an experiment. We're going to run this experiment, see if it works. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court then, against constitutional challenges on public purpose and a variety of other things, said, the legislature has an obligation under the state constitution to fund public education, but that's a separate thing. As long as they're doing that, they can do other stuff, extra stuff. And this is one of their discretionary extra stuff things, and this is okay.
Okay, you've led 3 different questions kind of floating around in my mind right now. So first of all, let's address the nearest one. I totally understand passing a law that gives more money to certain areas of Wisconsin if their public schools are failing. I get that totally, but that's not what has happened in Wisconsin, right? They're taking money from the public tax dollar pot, and they're taking that away to give to the voucher schools, which then lowers the pot for the public schools. So it's not extra, it's a total, it's just making private schools get more money than public schools, right?
Right. Well, exactly. So what they're doing, so if you think of the pot of money that's available in the state of Wisconsin for the purposes of educating kids between the ages of 4 and 18, or actually 21, if you count kids who have special needs. If we're going to talk about that pot of money, now that pot of money is being divvied up in different ways. So it's being, it used to be being divvied up with all of the public school districts. Now it's divvied up with public school districts, independent charter schools that are not part of school districts, and then the 4 voucher programs. So private schools who elect to participate in the voucher program.
And then I totally know that, there's the bigger argument about school choice and let kids go where they want, but I want to focus more on the history of this in this hour. And because we're always going to argue that this is bad, and we're going to wrap up the show saying that voucher schools are bad, but I want to understand the politics of who has been pushing this, we know that there's been Supreme Court cases, and unfortunately, Wisconsin's been split right down the middle politically for so long, and that our Supreme Court has as well. We've had like a 4-3 majority conservative justice system for like most of the 2000s, except for right now, which is why we're jumping on this and trying to sue to get rid of vouchers. But who has been pushing this, and how come it keeps on expanding from an experiment in Milwaukee to an experiment in Racine? By the way, it's no longer an experiment when you do it statewide, and by the way, it's no longer an experiment when you include four different things. So it's no longer an experiment. But why does it keep growing, and who's pushing that?
Well, I'm going to back up just a minute. I will answer your question, but that experimental justification also has evaporated. So originally it was that we're going to do this because we think it's going to be a way to help us get to better outcomes. The whole theory that Milton Friedman had was if you put schools in competition, the best schools will attract the most students and will leverage the schools that aren't doing so well to get better. And, everybody will get better as a result. That hasn't happened, didn't happen. And so the justifications for vouchers are now really just centered on choice is a good thing. We think parents should be able to choose what school their kid goes to with public money. Choice is good. We're going to have these choice programs. So who's pushing it? Well, again, as kind of that earlier history on issues around small government. So anyone who has a view that government should be smaller and smaller is someone who's going to be a champion of vouchers. Originally in the state, if you look back on the history, it was a little more bipartisan at the very beginning, because you had people from Milwaukee from both parties who were like, we're really tired of our kids not getting what they should get. Let's try this. Let's see if it works. So at the beginning, there was some bipartisan support for that. Although all along, and in particular, in the last 2 decades in particular, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, has created model bills that then come to states that then get enacted. And our bill, in fact, has some ties to ALEC. At least some people suggest that it has some ties to ALEC. So
hold on, let me stop you there. So you've just introduced ALEC to the world. For the viewers who are not that political, ALEC is a very right-wing organization that writes bills and sends them to Republican legislators in every single state in America, and they try to get the same legislation passed in every single state. So these bills to expand the voucher program are politically driven by Republicans, and this is, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, that if they weaken public schools, there's lots of outcomes for certain people with special interests. If they weaken public schools, they strengthen religious schools, because most of the schools that are private, a lot of them have a religious background to them. If they weaken public schools, they weaken teachers' unions, which at least in Wisconsin was one of the top Democratic they were the ones that were able to get governors elected. I helped Jim Doyle get elected in the early 2000s, and the teachers union, WEAC, was if you got the money from the teachers union as a governor, chances are you were going to get a lot of good, advertising dollars out of that. And then you could win in a political race. And so the weakening of public schools strengthens the Republican Party. Am I right there, Professor?
Well, I think, the argument basically goes back to that smaller government is always good. Distributing resources is always better. Private actors can do a better job than public actors, right? That's been an argument, because this idea of privatization hasn't been just applied in education. It's been applied in lots of other spheres as well, where heretofore funds
like healthcare.
That went to, or, prisons is another example. The, monies that heretofore only went to public organizations now go to private organizations. So it's part of that idea that competition in this private sphere can be leaner and more responsive and can deliver. That's been the argument that people have made. Yes, you're right. If the public school systems, which are at least nominally unionized, even still in the state of Wisconsin, have fewer members because the private system has gotten bigger, that's going to blunt the effect that union might have on all kinds of issues, especially issues around public education. And, the public education is the number one expenditure in the budget. The lion's share of our, if you do the pie chart, the biggest piece of the pie in the state budget is public education. So any way that you can affect that, and, some of the arguments they make are that, well, it'll be cheaper if we do it this way. I don't think, it depends on what you think, but that's, it's going back to this idea that publicness is really only a function of funding, whereas I would argue that publicness has at a minimum 5 dimensions, and funding is just one of them. And so if you're chipping away at all of those aspects of publicness, we're taking something that's belonged to all of us and frankly giving it away.
Expand on the other 4.
Okay, so
that makes a whole lot of sense.
I was going to say the same thing. Tell me about the other 4. What are the other 4 before we go to the break? Go ahead.
You whetted my appetite.
All right. So number 1, public purpose. So an education has always served both a public purpose and a private purpose, right? How I educate myself and my children is a private purpose, but there's also a public purpose. I benefit from the fact that Kirk is well educated and that Patti is well educated and that my neighbor's kids are well educated and the person who fixed my car yesterday is well educated. I benefit from other people's education. So it's that public purpose of education. Then you've got public funding, which is a way that we express that public purpose and fund it. And in fact, it's a constitutional obligation in our state and others. Then you've got public access, which means that this body serves everybody. There is nobody that we tape up a note that says, go away, you're not part of the public we serve. We serve everybody. So public purpose, public funding, public access, public accountability to communities so that we elect our neighbors, both in our local school boards, in the state legislature, the governor, the the superintendent here in our state, the superintendent of public instruction, our federal officers, both in Congress and the president. All of those people have a role in educational policy formation. And therefore, we have a way as voters to hold our schools accountable to the public by trying to champion the ideas that we think are good ones, and also by voting people that we think align with our views about what should happen. And then we pass tons of laws, both state and federally, that hold schools accountable and set minimum standards of what can happen in a school. And then finally, public curriculum. So public purpose, public funding, public access, public accountability to communities, and public curriculum. So we decide together what it means to be an educated person and what those minimum requirements are for being an educated person in your community or, in this state or elsewhere. So we have state standards of what must happen in a school. We test kids according to those state standards. All those kinds of things are ways that we have a public curriculum. And then there's a voice into what should be in the curriculum in your local community.
Like you got to teach Darwin as opposed to the kids were just created from a snake and an apple or something like that.
Well,
right?
you teach to understand, not necessarily to believe, as I've always shown my students. So you don't have to believe that you'll ever use the quadratic equation, but you got to learn it if you're in advanced math, right? And the same thing, you may not believe evolution, but you have to learn it because it's the foundation for a lot of our scientific thinking.
It's based on fact. Anyway, let's
that too.
Let's take a break here. I'm so excited to be talking to, of course, we have Kirk Bangstead, who's leading the charge for the right-wing war on public education. And we are joined by Professor Emerita, Julie Mead. Do I have that introduction correct as well? Thank you so much, Professor. I really am grateful for your conversation, for your insight, your expertise. We're going to take a break here. And by the way, folks, you can post questions on Minocqua Brewing Company's Facebook page, on the Patti Vasquez Show page, WCPT Facebook page. We are broadcasting on all those platforms. We would love to hear from you if you have a question for us. And we will continue when we come back on the Heartland Signal and 9:50 a.m. KTNF in Minneapolis, St. Paul. More in a moment.
Minocqua Brewing Company is excited to partner with Equality Vines to create Choice Wine. Choice Wine comes in two choices, Rosé and Sauvignon Blanc. This wine was created to support women's reproductive rights after the Supreme Court rolled back Roe v. Wade in 2022 and caused chaos all over the country. For our Up North podcast listeners, go to choice.equalityvines.com and be sure to use the promo code UPNORTH to get 10% off your next order. That's choice.equalityvines.com and use the promo code UPNORTH.
Let me die. And now back to the right-wing war on education.
We are continuing our conversation about the right-wing war on education. Joining us as our sponsor and leading the charge in Wisconsin, suing the hell out of everybody. I don't know if it's everybody, but it's who needs to be. Lawsuit needs to happen. Is it everybody, Kirk?
I need a vacation, Patti. There's no doubt about it. I'm suing everybody. I'm suing the town of Minocqua. I'm suing Oneida County, and in about 2 weeks, I'll be suing the state of Wisconsin on these voucher schools. You know, it's tough. It's tough being the guy that sues everybody. There's no doubt about it.
But here's the thing: is that this is where we are getting things done and moving the ball forward. And we're thrilled to have with us Professor Emerita Julie Mead joining us as an expert with the history of the vouchers, you know, the way they've decimated public education, whether it's in Wisconsin or across the country. And Kirk, you wanted to start this conversation about, what does this mean for public education? Why do people want charter schools? Go ahead, Kirk. You had a specific question in regards to where we go next with this conversation.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the reason we're going to bring a lawsuit in a couple of weeks is because I have heard, and when I talked to my good friend Julie Underwood, she's like, this is really gonna go off a cliff in about 2 years when the voucher school, when the actual maximums of what you can make as a parent kind of get lifted. There's no caps in about 2 years, so you can be the richest person ever and take public funding to send your kid to a private school in about 2 years.
Not quite.
Okay, I said the caps. Okay, so maybe I don't understand it right, but she said well, you can correct me in the next question.
The cap part is right, but let me explain the cap. How would I do that?
Okay, all right.
So we have 4 voucher programs in the state of Wisconsin. 3 are income limited. So the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program and the Racine Parental Choice Program now require that the family makes no more than 300% of the federal poverty limit in the first year the child qualifies. If the family's fortunes increase after year 1, the child stays in the program with public funding, no matter how much money the parent makes. The Wisconsin Parental Choice Program is 220% of the federal poverty level, so a little stricter eligibility requirement. Again, that only applies to the first year that the child is eligible for that program. And then the special needs scholarship program has no income limit on it at all. So it doesn't matter what the family's income is. If you have an eligible child with a disability, you can participate in that program. The cap that she's talking about is, so the Milwaukee program has no cap. It started with a 1% limit on the number of kids that could participate in the program. It no longer has any limit. The Racine program no longer has any limit. And the Wisconsin statewide program, this year's limit is 8% of a single school district. So no school district can be required to provide vouchers to more than 8% of their membership. So the membership is all the public kids and all the kids who are in private schools being supported by vouchers.
I've been known to
26, 27, no more cap.
Yeah.
So 26, and so it's going to go next year, it'll go up to 9%. So this school year, the one we're in now, 23, 24, it's 8%. Next year, it'll go up to 9%. Then the year after that, it'll go up to 10%. And the year after that, there will be no cap. So that's what she's talking about, is when the cap comes off statewide, you can expect the same kind of increase in enrollment, because remember that there is no requirement that the child ever was enrolled in a public school. So the majority of kids, and when they started tracking the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program at the beginning, if you looked at those charts from DPI, you'd see that the vast majority of the kids are not what we call sector switchers, who are moving from public education into private education. They were already in the private schools. The only thing that shifted was who paid the tuition. Did scholarship pay the tuition, the parents pay the tuition, or does the state pay the tuition? And so the big concern is that when those caps come off, what are we going to do? Because the way that the vouchers and the charters, and one of the things that makes the impact so difficult is that the vouchers and the independent charter schools have an amount of money that's guaranteed for that child. Absolutely guaranteed for that child. There is no such guarantee for the kids in the public system. So the silly analogy I use is this. So imagine that you have a family, let's say you're family of four, and you're tired today. So you ordered a pizza. So the pizza comes and you're going to split it 4 ways because there's 4 of you, right? And you're pretty much equal. Pull it out. And then, you have some friends who surprise you and come over. Well, you're not going to deny them any pizza. You're going to, bring them in, right? But the way the voucher system works and the charter system works is that they have a guaranteed size of the slice, and they get their slice first. So in Wisconsin parlance, we call that the first draw. So the first draw is they count up all the kids in the independent charters, and they're guaranteed for this school year $11,385. So their piece of the pizza goes. Then they count all the voucher kids, and the voucher kids, if they're in kindergarten through 8th grade, I'm looking at my notes so I get this right, will get $9,893. If they're in high school, they'll get $12,387. And if they're in the special needs scholarship program, they'll get a minimum of $15,065. So those people get their piece of the pie first, and then whatever's left over gets split by the people who were there to start. That's part of the worry, right? Is that the state legislature, while expanding choice, hasn't dumped a commensurate amount of money into the system to account for the fact that we've got a whole lot more people that we're publicly funding that we weren't publicly funding before.
So this leads completely to my question. There's a guy in Madison, by the way, that sends me all this data because he's been following this for so much. Just a shout out to Charles Uphoff if you're listening tonight, Charles. But he has shown me, and I'm in northern Wisconsin, where there's not, northern Wisconsin, there's no race issues here. Unfortunately, there's no diversity. We're basically all white, and there's either a Catholic school or a public school in most of our small towns in northern Wisconsin. And he sent me these graphs that show that the allocation per pupil for so many of our northern Wisconsin schools is like $3,000 a kid or something like that. And he's showing me that these maximums for the voucher schools are like 9,000 up to 15, you said, for some kids.
The special needs scholarship program.
So tell me, like, what does this mean? Is this, when the rubber hits the road, it sounds like a lot less money is allocated to kids that go to public schools, even currently, not even what's going to happen in the future. Can you tell us how that, when the growth of the system, what has happened to Wisconsin public schools over the last 20 years because of this growth of the voucher school system?
Well, again, a larger portion of their money, because it's meant to be a kind of a pass through, right? In fact, that's what you'll hear some legislators say. Well, the school district can levy up to the amount of the voucher and the money just comes in and goes out. So it's a zero-sum game, which is not really accurate. To really understand it, you have to have a basic understanding of how schools are funded in Wisconsin. Now, I always joke that if you use the word tertiary, you're in trouble. And you have to read about and understand the totality of school funding. That there's negative aid, tertiary aid. It gets really complicated, which the cynic in me wonders if maybe that's on purpose. But to boil it down to kind of the simplest level, the largest chunk of school funding is what we call state equalization aid. Now that's tied to something that's called a revenue cap. In the mid-90s, about the same time that these voucher programs were being developed, the state legislature froze the amount of money that a public school could spend per pupil. And they call that the revenue limit or the revenue cap. That's what you hear people talk about. Now that revenue cap, then I talk in a lot of analogies. The analogies I use is a box. So imagine you had a box and the box always had to be full. And it had to be full of two kinds of money, right? Either it was full of money that some of that money is from the state aid, and some of that money is from local property taxes. But the box is always full. And the equalization idea is that if you are a property rich district, math is in your favor. If you tax yourself at a low rate because, small number times a big number because property wealth still get you quite a bit of money, right? So you don't have to tax yourself very hard to get a big chunk of money to be able to expend. So when that's true, in that box, the amount of state aid goes down because you're able to raise enough local property taxes. The inverse is true in a property poor district. There, math is not your friend. You can tax yourself at a high rate, but a high rate times a little number is still a little number. And so you can't get enough from local property taxes. So the state gives you more state aid. So you get more state aid, less from local property taxes. Now, in that revenue cap system, you can see the problem, because if the legislature says we're injecting more money into the system, if they did not allow you to get a bigger box, the only thing injecting more money in the system does is it lowers property tax. It's really a property tax relief mechanism. So to get more money for schools, to spend one more penny on a kid, you have to get a bigger revenue cap. And the state legislature hasn't been doing that. It used to be that the revenue cap was tethered to the consumer price index. So as costs got more expensive, gas, heating, the whole ball of wax, healthcare, then you had an increase in the revenue cap automatically built into the statute. In 2011, at the same time that we passed Act 10 that restricted teachers' unions, we also enacted a law that took that tether away. So now the only way to get a bigger box is if the legislature gives it to you or your school district goes to referendum. Have you noticed how many more referenda we have across the state? They're just burgeoning everywhere. So how does that all relate to vouchers? Well, the way vouchers are funded is, again, that guaranteed piece of the pie, right? So to understand the impact on a given school district, you have to know what their revenue cap is. And so the idea is that you can levy up to the amount of the revenue cap. Well, if you get enough state aid to cover the voucher, then I guess it is in and out, right? But most do not. So that means that the voucher amount is going to be some, just like education for public school kids, some of it is going to come from the voucher, from the state aid, and some of it is going to come from local property taxes. So if you don't get enough state aid to cover the voucher, the local property taxes have to subsidize it in order to get it. That's how all of this money is going in and going out. And what we have going on this year that I'm watching, that I'm just wondering what in the world is going to happen. The data from the Legislative Fiscal Bureau for last school year, I haven't seen this school year's numbers yet, but for last school year, the average revenue cap, so state aid plus and local property taxes, was $11,888. Well, $11,888 is less than $12,387, the cost of the high school voucher. So what is that going to mean for school districts who are in that, that low level of voucher cap territory? Now, the new change in our new budget did say that 11,000 kind of becomes the minimum revenue cap for a school district, but 11,000 is still less than 12,387. So to understand the impact in a school district, you have to know both the revenue cap in your school district. You have to know the amount of state aid that you qualify per student in your school district. And then you have to compare that to the voucher amounts. And that's where that whole notion of guaranteed money and non-guaranteed money comes into play, because the kids in the voucher programs and the independent charter schools are guaranteed their slice.
Yeah.
And the kids in the public system get to divvy up whatever's left after those guarantees are met.
One of the things that I will never understand is, and this will be a whole nother hour someday, is how property taxes have been tied into how we fund public school. So let me, to what you've just said then, will local cities and municipalities have to raise their property taxes in order for kids to get public education, or to send them out to voucher schools? Oh my God.
Right?
Therein lies the rub.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, wait. Let me point that out. What you just said is the cool.
They can't raise their taxes because of the revenue caps unless they go to referendum.
They have to get people to vote in their city to raise their own property taxes, but a lot of that money is going to get shoveled away to people that are sending their kids to private schools and not public schools. You have to convince a taxpayer to give more money away so that their neighbor can send their kid to a Catholic school in most of northern Wisconsin. That's what's happening right now. That's insanity.
To give you
that language in the ballot.
I put up a couple of numbers, and one of the things that people have championed, and I think it's died in committee for years now, is a transparency bill. So that when you get your property tax bill, that it lays out, you know how it lays out now, that so much money is going to the school district, so much money is going to the community college district in your area, and so forth, that one of those lines would be vouchers, and another line would be independent charters. But to give you an idea, last year from 2022-23, Green Bay paid $8,617,604.70 for vouchers.
How much pay for public schools?
I don't have that number. Sorry, I only pulled up.
So,
but
I mean,
yeah.
So what we would like, I would love to see, and I'm sure my lawyers are already kind of laying this out because we talked about it today. like you're right. The transparency of your property tax bill. Just imagine if like the Notre Dame Catholic school in Green Bay is getting, and you pay your property taxes and you send your kids to public school. Just imagine if that bill that of your like $7,000 or whatever that you paid this year, and you saw 60% of it go to a private school, and you were sending your kid to a public school. How infuriated would you be?
It would be a while before those are the proportions, but that is the issue. But I think, and also, some of the data that we have, looking at Milwaukee in that way, it is an experiment. We can see how it's expanded and what's happened. And of course, entire schools and even kind of school chains or school systems have sprung up in Milwaukee in order to take advantage of this. And we have numerous schools in Milwaukee that participate in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program that are 100% voucher enrolled, meaning not one student attends that private school by means of private dollars, that their tuition is all paid for by public dollars. 100. I did an analysis of the system it was years ago now. I think it was 2015. And at that time, we had 50 schools that were 90 to 99.9% voucher enrolled. And then I think we had another 18 or so that were 100% voucher enrolled. I mean, that's kind of amazing.
When you say that, when you say that there are schools where they're all voucher enrolled, so meaning they're taking all that money from public education. So this is not unique, as we know, to Wisconsin. This is happening in dozens of states across the country. And I have to imagine that I know that you're very good at threading the needle as to why this is happening from which political party. However, we know that like the conservatives and the right wingers are thrilled to be taking money out of public education, to devalue education across the board. And also the rich people are like, oh, look, I'm contributing to this private school, to this charter school. And they're also lifting that up. Why is this happening all over the country?
Well, it's happening, now. And one thing I have to emphasize is that both voucher programs, their cousins, tax credit scholarship programs and education savings accounts, and charter schools, all of those measures, those sometimes called school reform measures, are creatures of the state legislatures that create them. So the state legislatures decide what a voucher program is and what the rules are about who can participate, what schools can participate, all of that. So what's a voucher program in Wisconsin is going to have similarities to what's happening in Indiana, but it's not going to be exactly the same. Same thing with charter schools. They're all creatures of the state legislature. So in that way, you can see what choices the state legislature has made. So one of the questions that I have, and that I've actually written about, is at what point is a legislative desire to subsidize private education subvert their obligation under the state constitution to fund public education?
Yes.
Because public education is a constitutional obligation. The voucher program is a discretionary act. So as one of my students years ago said, oh, I get it. Public schools are you're doing your homework, and private schools are going out to play. Yes. So if you're going to play in voucher land, according to our Constitution as currently written, in most states and in our state in particular, you have to meet your constitutional obligation to public schools. That's mandatory on the state legislature's part. It says the state legislature shall, not the state legislature will if they have if they have enough money to. The state legislature shall. They don't have any comparable obligation on the private voucher programs, right? So
Kirk's head's gonna explode. He needs to jump in here. Kirk, what's your thing?
Professor Mead, what happens? What is the end of this? It sounds like a race to the bottom. Can you project in the future what happens if we keep on expanding voucher schools at the expense of, what does it look like? What does our public school, what does our education world look like in Wisconsin?
Well, I think the worry that I have, and actually I think in some ways those people in the early 90s who were writing and saying, don't do this, this is not a good idea, don't do this. All of the things they were worrying about, we now have empirical data to document. And so one of the things that bothers me is that these programs have rarely, and not in our state certainly, and not in other states, have not been enacted by virtue of an up or down vote where that was the only thing our legislators were voting on. They're often, in fact, the last three programs, the special needs scholarship program was in the budget bill of 2015. The Wisconsin parental choice program was in the budget bill of 2013. The Racine parental choice program was in the budget bill of 2011. So when they're in those big omnibus bills, my representative gets one vote, and that one vote is for the entire budget, right? Roads and parks and everything. And so it makes it harder for somebody to vote no on that, even if they don't like the voucher program. So it bothers me that we've had this proliferation without ever having that real policy argument. And, I still believe that, if it's a good idea, it can withstand the sunshine of a good argument.
Yeah.
And we haven't had that. The other things that people worried about was that, it would lead to more segregation. And that has been borne out by the data. The schools tend to be more single race than before. So when you look at the schools.
Well, what about destroying? I want to see what's the future of public schools if this keeps happening? Do they die?
I think that's what happens. It's because you have, again, when the funding is happening, it's not like all 5 kids that left the public school all came out of the same class. They're spread all over. So you can't have a dollar for dollar deduction in the amount of money it costs to deliver education in that community. So the public schools are left scrambling, and this also injects a whole lot more unpredictability and insecurity into the system. It's much harder for school leaders to be able to predict what money they're going to get, what money is going to go out, how many more kids might enter into the voucher program or not enter the voucher program. So it's a lot harder to predict and to be able to manage the funds that they do have. And then we also talk about, is particularly up where you are, Kurt, there's a number of school districts where we talk about those school districts reaching a point where their populations is going down so precipitously, it's difficult for them to have enough money. And then you have the specter of perhaps having to declare bankruptcy in your school district and close your school district.
I'm so grateful that we're having these conversations. I have to sign off for WCPT and thank everyone for joining us. Mike Crute's up next with Devil's Advocates. Thank you, Alejandro, Matt Cummings, and Jerry Walski. And of course, Monaco Brewing Company is sponsor of the segment. We can continue on our live stream. We don't have to go anywhere here, but if you guys want to join us, if you're listening on the terrestrial radio, join us over here. Good night, everybody, on WCPT and KTNF 950 AM. We can keep talking.
Wow, that was a quick hour.
You were concerned. Hi, you did fantastic. And by the way, my sister-in-law is watching, so you dazzled.
We didn't even get to talk about special ed, and
I know.
No, we can talk about special ed. So I meant we are broadcasting on Facebook Live. Monaco Brewing Company obviously has a great audience. We have our audience on our Patti Vasquez show page and on WCPT. So my question about special ed, I would like to know, because I have a son who has had an IEP since he was 3 years old. From what I understand in Chicago, friends of mine who've tried having their kids who have cerebral palsy or Down syndrome in charter schools, this is now we're talking about 2008 or so. Those charter schools did everything they could to force those kids out. They did not have the capacity to do what was needed to meet the IEP, which is a legally bonding agreement, right? So how does that work how's that working in Wisconsin? And why aren't people, everyone always wants to help the kids with disabilities until it means paying for that education, doesn't it?
Okay, so I give you numbers again. So I'm going to explain how both charters and vouchers, and this I'll mention Suzanne Eckes, who's another professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who she and I did a study. We wrote a paper together explaining, as we called it, how privatization opens the door to discrimination. And there are 3 factors. The first factor is that discrimination as a legal matter is defined differently in public spaces than it is in private spaces. In other words, what constitutes discrimination in a private school is not the same as what constitutes discrimination in a public school. So in other words, they're held to a much lower standard of who they have to include. The second thing is that these state legislatures who have created these programs have not really attended to discrimination and have not written anti-discrimination provisions into their voucher and charter laws. Charters more so, and I'll explain why in just a second, but vouchers, no. And then the third reason is the fact that the schools themselves, because they can serve, they're serving a voluntary population, get to define the programs. And because they get to define the programs in a private school in terms of kids with disabilities only has to make modifications to existing programs. So if I don't offer that program, I don't have to add it. And if I can't modify what I already have to help your kid, I can legitimately say no to your kid.
Yep.
And that does not constitute discrimination. Now, charter schools are at least putatively, a form of public education, and they're supposed to abide by federal law to the same degree as all public schools. So this pushing out or counseling out is really a violation of federal law. It's not supposed to happen. Does it happen? Yes, but it's not supposed to happen. But you still have what I call the most excellent promise problem. So even if you have a well-meaning charter school leader who understands their obligations under state and federal law, and you come in and you say, I have my child, here are my child's needs, and they can say, well, right now, we don't have the personnel to meet your child's needs, but should you enroll here, we make you our most excellent promise that we're going to get you the services that your child needs. Now, obviously, in a market-based system, is the rational parent going to say, I'll take your most excellent problem or promise, or are they going to go down the street and to the public school that has the services because they have to have the services and enroll their child in the public school? So, one of the things you talked about before is, we're going to have a greater concentration of kids with special needs, both by virtue of disabilities, but also by virtue of language learning needs, for example, folks for whom their first language is not English. These private schools don't have to provide language learning needs to language learning services in the same way that public schools do. Public schools do, private schools don't.
So the amount of money that these kids need is a lot more, because you got to hire ESL teachers, you got to hire special ed teachers, but yet that money is getting siphoned away as a and to
if you really want to go, what? The special needs scholarship program in Wisconsin requires that the child have an IEP to be eligible to get that 15,000 and change, or for the school to get that 15,000 and change on their behalf. Let's do it right. But once the child is enrolled in that private school that's participating in the special needs scholarship program, the parent and the school, the private school people, look over the IEP and they decide what they're going to deliver. They do not have to deliver any of the services that are in the IEP.
But they can take the 15,000.
But they can take the 15,000
until the third Friday. Until the third Friday.
Well, as long as the parent says that what they agree to provide is sufficient. If the parents say, okay with me, then they can take the money without providing any services to the child. And even if they do provide services to the child, the personnel don't have to have any special expertise in order to provide those services, unlike the public sector. Sorry, that's my dog. And then,
your dog's like, it's been an hour. TikTok.
Yeah. All right. We probably should go, but geez, Louise, this is
yeah. We will continue. I really am so grateful for everything today, Professor. And like I said, you impressed my sister-in-law, so that's gonna get me some good points at Thanksgiving. That's what I'm saying. Really great conversation. Thank you so much, Kirk, for everything that you do.
Thanks for having me. Professor, you made it easy, but I'm sorry we didn't get to all the topics.
Oh. No, we did. No, please. We covered so much ground and really informative and important, like I told you it would be. So thank you so much for that. Thank you, Kirk. I really, this is incredible. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care.
Have a great night, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You're listening to The Right Wing War on Education, brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company.